Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 229 Gothic Literature, where we are talking about Frankenstein. If you'll remember last class, I had you view the very iconic 1930s film by James Whale for Frankenstein. And as many of you indicated in your comments in our discussion forum, the film is a very different entity than the novel itself. I think of it as two different stories rather than thinking of it as a adaptation, though all adaptations ultimately take some liberties. But the film is a very different story than what Mary Shelley gave us, as many of you noted. So what I wanted to do was to begin with that film just so that you could see how that film has probably made Frankenstein into one of these iconic texts that are known through that happen to be known through popular culture. And in fact, Frankenstein has never been out of print, and I suspect that one of the reasons why is because of the influence of that particular film, that somehow this story has captured readers' imaginations and film viewers' imaginations. But before I started talking about the text itself and also a little bit more about the film, I wanted to draw your attention to the notes that I have at the bottom of this video. And these are notes that basically just summarize what I'm talking about in the video. And you can see that the first section is entitled Additional Moodle Sections. So I've added two additional Moodle sections to the top of our Moodle page. One is entitled Assignments Due. And what I've done is I've listed all of the dates and all of the assignments that are going to be due. Now, that said, you can find all of that in the course outline, but if you wanted to see it all on one page, you can access that with assignments due. And certainly if it turns out that you needed additional time with one of the assignments, just ask me for an extension and I'll be happy to grant it to you. And one of your first assignments, or in fact your first graded assignment, will be a journal about Frankenstein that I'll talk about in a moment. But I also have another section at the top of Moodle that's entitled Past Class Sessions. So what I'm doing is after each week has elapsed is I'm putting those videos and the class notes in that folder for past class sessions so that you can access the past class sessions at your convenience if you so wanted to do so, but that what you will see each week happens to be that particular week that's visible of our notes and our videos, so that hopefully it'll make it a little bit easier to find content. So in terms of thinking about the assignments due, your first assignment, as I indicated, is going to be a journal. And journals are meant to be just informal responses to all of the major Gothic texts that we are reading this semester. And the first Gothic text we're reading this semester is Frankenstein. And yes, we did begin by talking a little bit about Stephen King and H.P. Lovecraft, mostly to help establish some foundation for Gothic and horror. And you could utilize any of those sources at any point in the semester if you wanted to. But basically, our first journal is in relation to Frankenstein itself. And the idea is that you would write approximately a page or so of reflections, questions, thoughts that you might have about the text. Not plot summary, but just observations. In other words, not what happened, but why did some of those things happen? And certainly you can reference things like our class videos and the discussion forums, and also as your own thoughts and observations. In fact, with the discussion forums, what you would have seen is that I would have responded to all of your responses. So I encourage you to read all of those, as well as read your classmates' posts and my responses to their posts, because that ultimately will give you a sense of what it is that we talked about during class discussion. And in the forum, I might sometimes post a response as a question. Not that you have to necessarily respond to that particular question to your post. It's just something to help inspire thought. But certainly if you wanted to respond to it, you can. And I do encourage you to list the forum responses on your Moodle page in nested form. That'll probably be the easiest way for you to see everyone's posts and then the responses directed to that particular post. Though you've got lots of different settings that you can utilize based on your preference, but I think the nested format is probably the easiest way to get a sense of what might have occurred during a class discussion. But at any rate, that journal, you can think of it almost like your annotations. Certainly you can write more than a page, but as much or as little as you like, and you will be writing a journal on each of the major Gothic texts. So at the end, you'll have a good amount of writing for all of the works that we've studied over the course of the semester. And I evaluate it based on content. I don't read for grammar or mechanics. And basically, I evaluate it in an informal way on a checkmark system. So a plus is excellent, and a check plus is very good, and a check is satisfactory. And their grade's lower than that, but most people end up within that first three range, and that's exactly where you want to be over the course of the semester. So I try to have a conversation with you on paper, and I might occasionally ask you a question in the journal. Again, not that you have to answer it, but just something to inspire some thought. And then eventually, what will end up happening is that you will be doing a more formal writing assignment, an academic paper about one of the Gothic texts in the earlier part of the semester. And I'm going to be talking about that more over the next several classes, as well as giving you suggested paper topics. And you're free to choose any of those suggested paper topics, but you are also free to create your own paper topic as long as you get it approved by me. So you can use the journals perhaps as a way to try out some ideas for the papers if you so wanted to do something like that. Though, again, you're not required to. And in relation to the papers, I'm thinking about approximately 4 to 5 pages of more in-depth analysis about a specific area in one of the Gothic texts, as opposed to the journals, which basically don't have any particular focus. And I will evaluate the papers based on grammar and mechanics as well as content and put a letter grade on it. But for that first paper, which is due approximately halfway through the semester, after I return that back to you, then basically you have the option of rewriting it for a higher grade and based on my comments and so forth. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as the semester progresses. At this point, I can tell you I'm playing with a new grading program, and I believe the easiest way to go about doing this is for you to submit in your graded assignments via PDF to my email, which happens to be ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. Then I can return them back to you with my comments. As I said, it's a new program, so I'm still playing with it. So if it turns out that that isn't working, we'll figure out something else. But at this point, this seems to be the way that would be the most efficient in terms of getting assignments and responding back to you. So, in relation to Frankenstein itself, in the 1931 film, if you were looking carefully at the credits, you might have noticed that it said that it was based on the novel by Mrs. Percy Shelley. So the first point I wanted to talk about was based on the novel. So, and this is always the difficulty with a film adaptation. It's just that, an adaptation. So you always need to read the text because the text will be different than the film. But especially this particular film, it's in some ways a completely different narrative than what we find with what Mary Shelley wrote. The second piece I wanted to focus on was the Mrs. Percy Shelley, which says a great deal about the role of female during this time period, that rather than referring to her through her individual identity, she was referred to as Mrs. and as Percy Shelley. That is her husband's name. And he was a very famous romantic author during the time period. It's one of the reasons why perhaps that she had the liberties of being able to write and publish in a time period when many other women didn't necessarily have that particular privilege and that particular access. I talk about this text in my Women in Literature class, where we talk about texts written in the 1800s by female. And we'll talk a little bit more about this text from that particular lens, though this is a Gothic literature class, so obviously our focus is going to be on Gothic literature. Something else that many of you noted in the discussion forum was the name switch between Victor and Henry, and how that has led to perhaps unnecessary confusion between the film and the text. That said, if you think about when the film was made in the 1930s, and you think about Victor as having lots of associations with German names, perhaps it was best not to have our lead character with a German name in the 1930s when you think about some of the political turmoil that we experienced during that time period. Also, what you might have noticed in the opening credits is that the quote monster unquote was unnamed. We weren't given the actor's name until the end. That happened to be Boris Karloff. That led to building some suspense amongst the audience members. This was an iconic role for Boris Karloff. It basically made his career. When we talk about Bela Lugosi of Dracula fame, we'll talk about how he was offered this role of Frankenstein and he turned it down. And it was probably one of the worst career moves he could have made. But nevertheless, Boris Karloff took this role for the monster, quote unquote. And the reason why I say that is because I think both the film and the text are similar in that the true monster is Victor and humanity as a whole, rather than the creature. And that even with its grotesque appearance and its quote reign of terror in the film, we can still empathize with this creature. Certainly, we see how he's tormented by Fritz. Fritz the Hunchback, which has become very cliche in Gothic films. Never in Shelley's text did Fritz appear. And also even that scene with the girl where, and it's different in the novel, which we'll talk about, but in the film, he's playing with the young child with flowers, and he doesn't understand the difference between throwing a flower petal in the water and throwing the girl in the water, because again, he just doesn't understand because he hasn't been given an opportunity to be taught about things like life and death. So it was an error on his part. It wasn't deliberate. It wasn't malicious to try to drown the girl. But in those ways, we can feel a certain amount of empathy and sympathy for the creature. But especially in the text, we will feel empathy and sympathy for the creature, who is basically created as a blank slate, a tabula rasa, if you've heard that term from philosophy, and in many ways is shaped by his environment. He learns evil and he learns revenge through those around him. And I know that while many of you had indicated that the film has plot holes, the text does too. One of the biggest plot holes, perhaps, is when the creature, after it's created, happens to find a satchel of books in the wilderness. And he happens to eavesdrop on a family that is teaching English to a new member of the family, and he's able to teach himself how to read and how to speak and even how to write. And then he's able to read the satchel, or he's able to read the books in the satchel, which includes some of the finest literary texts of the time, including Paradise Lost. So I always chuckle a little bit about that. I wish it would have been that easy when I was a student, just to find a satchel of books in the wilderness that I needed for class. And I'm sure you probably feel the same. But nevertheless, considering Mary Shelley's tender age of 19 when she created this text, I guess we can forgive some of those lapses in the actual text itself. In terms of thinking about the actual name of both the film and the text, the title Frankenstein, that is in reference to the creator, not to the creature. The creature is never given a name, and this is also going to be very telling as well, because it's one of the first responsibilities a parent has after creating life. And in many ways, we can say that Victor Frankenstein from the text is the father, is the creator of this life, and negates his responsibility after he creates it. In fact, if we think about the title for the text, it's shortened to Frankenstein, but the title as a whole is Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. And Prometheus is going to be important in terms of our understanding the text. Prometheus is from Greek mythology, and Prometheus was punished for stealing fire from the gods and giving it to humanity. And one of the things we'll talk about are the parallels between Prometheus stealing from the gods and being punished for it, and Victor Frankenstein stealing from the gods, trying to get the knowledge of how to basically beat death and to create everlasting life, and how he's punished for his hubris, for his extreme arrogance. That said, Mary Shelley makes lots of literary references in the text. I believe I had talked about this last class, that she was incredibly well read, came from a literary family, was married to Percy Shelley, and on the evening in which that great ghost story was written, not only was she with Percy Shelley and Lord Byron, another great romantic poet, she was also with someone named Dr. Polidori, who wrote a short story called The Vampire, which we believe was the inspiration, or at least partial inspiration, for Bram Stoker's Dracula. So that was a very important night when they dared each other to this ghost writing competition, at least in terms of the Gothic. In addition to Prometheus, we're going to get other literary references, and we can see this at the beginning of the text, where we get a reference to Milton's Paradise Lost. Now, John Milton happens to be a great epic poet, known best for his epic poem Paradise Lost, which happens to be about the story of man and how man is basically seduced by the devil to eat the forbidden knowledge of the apple, and ultimately is thrown out of paradise. And there are a good number of parallels between that and the creature himself, as well as another character in Paradise Lost that basically becomes, in many ways, the main character. In some ways, it's very subversive. We're supposed to be thinking of Jesus and thinking of God as the heroes in that epic poem, but we get much of that poem through Satan's perspective, and Satan talking about how he was initially created by God and then rejected and ultimately thrown out of hell, and then ultimately this new creation, has supplanted him when he was supposed to be the best and the brightest. This new creation being humanity, and that's what motivates him to try to seduce humanity to his side. So that said, I think we can see parallels with the creature, and the creature himself will be saying this throughout the text, that there are a good number of parallels that he has to Adam, being created by God and then ultimately not necessarily cared for, and also parallels with Satan, also being created by God and then being neglected and rejected. That said, another literary reference we're going to get is to Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. Christopher Marlowe was a poet during Shakespeare's time, and he's most known for his drama Dr. Faustus, which is based on a scholar named Faustus who's achieved infinite knowledge. So what he does is he sells his soul to the devil so that he can get the knowledge that is known only to the gods, such as making men live eternally. And what ends up happening in the drama is that Dr. Faustus squanders all of his time by basically playing pranks with the additional knowledge he's been given. And then eventually his time runs out. And this is when he's supposed to give his soul to the devil. And then when the devil comes to collect and is basically dragging Faustus into hell, this is when Faustus tries to repent. But it's too little too late. And again, it's a cautionary tale about what happens when you have so much hubris, extreme arrogance and pride, that you think that you can have the knowledge of the gods. And even though Faustus says he has good intentions initially, that he wants to help humanity by making men live eternally, we'll see how that doesn't come to fruition. And again, there are parallels with Victor as well. And we could say that Victor is motivated in some ways to create this creature, to try to outwit death, if you will, after the death of his mother, which we will talk about. Now, in terms of the novel, you can see that we've got several classes devoted to this particular novel because it is a longer text. We'll put closure to the novel on the 28th, which happens to be a Monday, a week from today. And on midnight of the 28th is when your first journal would be due. And again, if you needed an extension, you can ask. So what would be ideal is that you've had the novel read in its entirety by the first class we had assigned with Frankenstein, the class where we watched the movie. But the reality is that you've got up until the Monday of the 28th to finish the novel. So what I'm trying to do is to introduce the novel, understanding that you may all be in different places within the novel. But I'm hopeful that by the time we finish up on the 28th, you would have finished Frankenstein. And in fact, you've started the next set of readings, which happens to be about Edgar Allan Poe. So while we are spending class perhaps a couple of weeks for each of the major novels, the hope is that you can finish all of those texts at the beginning of our unit so that you can be reading and preparing for the next text that's coming up. But as you can see, I try to start slowly. We're still in an introduction in some ways with Frankenstein. First by introducing the movie that's become so iconic for popular culture. And now just sort of talking a little bit about the title and the beginning. And probably one of the most surprising things for people who have seen the film and then are reading the novel is that the novel begins so differently. It begins with the introduction of a character named Walton, someone who never appears in the film. And we are told this story through letters. Basically, Walton is a ship captain and he's writing to his sister Margaret, and he's telling her about how he's trying to make these new discoveries in relation to geography. And he also has encountered this strange individual by the name of Victor Frankenstein at sea. And he has, Victor Frankenstein, a very strange tale to tell. And what Walton is doing is he's basically writing out what Victor Frankenstein is telling him. And it's easy to forget this because once we shift from Walton's letters to Victor's stories, we can see that Victor's stories are told exactly the way Victor would have mentioned himself as an I. But the reality is that this is Walton quoting from Victor's I. So the entire story of Frankenstein is told through one character and one character only, Walton. This is going to be incredibly important for us in terms of narration and an unreliable narrator. How much can we trust Walton knowing that he's physically and emotionally exhausted, first of all? Secondly, he's trying to transcribe exactly what Victor is saying, and that's no easy task. And thirdly, he's doing it at the ending of the day when he has time after he has taken care of all of his ship duties. So all of the tale is in question because of that. And we'll talk about the unreliable narrator a little bit more as the semester progresses and as our examinations progress with Frankenstein in particular. And even if we could trust Walton, the difficulty is, can we trust Victor? And eventually Victor is going to tell us the creature's tale, but we never hear from the creature. Nor do we ever really hear from Victor. We hear from Walton telling us what Victor said that the creature said. So we've got narrative embedded within narrative embedded within narrative. If you haven't gotten to the ending of the novel, I can tell you that the ending of the novel gets us back to where we were with the beginning, with Walton at sea. So there's going to be some closure. But I can tell you right now that Walton is an incredibly important character, in part because he shares many characteristics that Victor shares. They're very similar in many ways, which we will discuss next class. So you wanted to make sure that you were paying close attention to that, even though that's something that the film doesn't give us. The epistolary novel, telling a tale through letters, was a very common technique in the 1800s, especially in terms of telling Gothic literature. In some ways, it can lend itself to giving a sense of validity because we've got written documentation. But in other ways, as I was just suggesting, it also increases our questions about the reliability of the narrator because we're getting information through one or just limited numbers of perspectives, depending on how many letters we're getting and who's writing that, as we will see with Dracula, which is also presented in a similar kind of way. But with Frankenstein, there is only one author, and that happens to be Walton. As we continue on as well, what we probably are accustomed to because of Hollywood is the huge creation scene that comes rather early in the film and takes a good amount of time. In the text, it comes much later and it doesn't take up nearly as much time, though this was the inspiration for the tale that Mary Shelley told, because on that fateful night of ghost storytelling, she went to sleep that night and basically dreamt the creation scene, and that was the inspiration for what followed afterwards. So this comparison between Walton and Victor Frankenstein in terms of things like both of them sharing ambition, both of them having hubris, both of them being isolated, both of them being lonely, is something that we will revisit, and oftentimes is something that we see in Gothic texts as well. If nothing else, Frankenstein is a morality tale. We're supposed to learn something from it. And if you'll remember Stephen King in Danse Macabre talking about his perspective, that most horror fiction is indeed based on the old morality tales from medieval times, where in medieval times they were basically biblical stories that were dramatized to teach a lesson. And now they've been modernized. They're not necessarily based on biblical stories per se, but they're still supposed to teach a moral, or they're supposed to teach a lesson, as we will see when we go through the text of Frankenstein itself. Frankenstein is made up of mostly male characters, and this also is somewhat surprising when we think about the author, who's female. I would suggest that that perhaps is one of the reasons why her text was so readily accepted during the time period that she gave us a male-centric novel. There are female characters. They mostly serve secondary roles, though there is a character named Safie who's quite surprising in terms of her level of independence, which we'll get to, with a subplot about the Lacey family. Again, in no way mentioned in the film at all, but very important in terms of our getting a sense of the creature. And in the film, you know that we've got basically this grunting, illiterate creature. And the text, what we get is the exact opposite, a very erudite and a very intelligent creature. And one of the ways that we learn this is how he's able to learn from watching the DeLacy family, which we will talk about as we continue on with the story. But I would suggest that despite the fact that we have these central male characters, what we have is a feminist commentary in the text. That basically what we see is how things go wrong in a male-centric world when female is excluded. Right down to a victor, a male, creating a creature without female. In other words, trying to give birth without female. And the consequences of that. So I think that's embedded within the text. And as I believe I had mentioned last class, Mary Shelley, when she originally showed her draft version of the story initially to her husband, Percy Shelley, he suggested that she expand and develop. And one of the things she did was to add lots of nature scenes, which was very common during the time period. This was known as the Romantics time period of literature, and the Romantics focused on nature and the natural world and humanity's relation to nature and the natural world. So we get these long descriptive paragraphs and these long descriptive passages about the natural world. And again, as a modern reader, you might see that as perhaps filler or not necessarily forwarding plot. Though again, during the time of the 1800s, this was oftentimes viewed as a literary convention. But that said, since nature is usually associated with the feminine, in fact, we talk about Mother Nature, may I suggest to you that the central character in this text, or one of the central characters in this text, is indeed female. It's Mother Nature. And when Victor is in Mother Nature, it's a very healing situation. It's only when he isolates himself from nature that terrible things happen. And we see something comparable as well with the creature itself, which we will talk about. So in terms of thinking about these things, there also is, as we go through the text, a good number of occult references. I was referencing how this text is oftentimes viewed as a science fiction text, and it definitely does have the possibility of that with enough science. And at the time period, electricity was viewed as basically this new invention and all of the possibilities associated with it, the fear and the awe that it inspired. And we've got that embedded within the text of Frankenstein as well. But outside of any kind of scientific possibilities, fairly early on in the novel, there's references to things like Philosopher's Stone and Cornelius Agrippa. Those are occult references that we will be talking about over the next couple of classes, which I think firmly cements this text in the tradition of the Gothic. As well as things like setting and atmosphere and tone, which both Lovecraft and Stephen King had talked about as well. So what we're going to do for our next class is I'm going to continue to discuss the novel Frankenstein, and I'll also begin to discuss things like papers and revisit the idea of journals. For today's attendance question, and this will be due on Tuesday the 22nd by 8 a.m. on our discussion forum, but if you need additional time, just let me know. I'll be happy to give it to you. I wanted to know what you thought about Mary Shelley's use of the epistolary novel technique. You'll remember that I said the epistolary novel is when you're told the story in letters rather than being given the action as it unfolds. So the question, for which there is no right or wrong answer, is did you personally like or dislike Mary Shelley's use of the epistolary novel technique and why? And this should be a question that you can answer even if you haven't finished the novel in its entirety yet. So I'm curious to see what you think about this mode of storytelling. And then next class, we'll continue on with talking about the plot itself and some of the ways that Mary Shelley uses the text as a cautionary tale for us as reader. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And next class we'll continue on with Frankenstein. And keep in mind that we've got an optional chat session on Mondays from 1 to 1:30 and optional Zoom sessions on Wednesdays from 1 to 1:30. And you're free to drop in. There isn't any particular format or agenda. Just anybody who's there can basically give comments or ask questions. Think of it as a kind of open office hour, if you will. And that said, if you can't make those, but you did want to talk with me, you can always make an appointment with me. Take care. Talk to you soon. Bye bye.